My name is Renata Calloway, but everyone in Bellwood, Pennsylvania calls me Ren. I'm 62 years old. I spent 28 years as a certified trust officer at Bellwood Trust and Savings, reading documents most people skim past: deeds, codicils, life estates, remainder interests, the fine print that decides who actually owns what when the people who love each other stop agreeing. In 28 years, I never once misread a document. Not one. So when my parents sat me down at their kitchen table and told me they'd decided to give my grandfather's orchard to my cousin Derek to keep it in the family, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I said, "All right," folded my napkin, and drove home. Because I already knew something my parents had forgotten, something my cousin's wife had never bothered to find out, and something that was about to make every signature on their new deed worthless. My grandfather didn't leave that orchard to whoever carried his last name. He left it to whoever he trusted to run it. And 40 years ago, he wrote that trust into a document so specific, so airtight, that not even his own son could undo it with a lawyer, a notary, and a Sunday afternoon. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where mothers carry more than anyone gives them credit for, and where the quiet ones are usually the ones holding the paperwork. If a family has ever tried to hand your inheritance to someone else to keep it simple, stay with me. Subscribe, and let's begin at the beginning. Whitfield Orchards and Cider Mill sits on 42 acres outside Bellwood, Pennsylvania, on a ridge my great-grandfather cleared with a mule team in 1931. My grandfather, Silas Whitfield, took it over in 1957 and turned 11 scraggly acres of Baldwin apples into the largest working cider mill in the county. By the time I was born, the Whitfield name meant something in that town. It was stitched onto feed caps, painted on the side of a barn you could see from the county road, printed on cider jugs sold in 4 states. Silas built that business with his hands, his stubbornness, and a mind for numbers that skipped a generation and landed, of all places, in me. I grew up on that orchard. I picked apples before I could reach the low branches without a stool. I learned to run the old squeezer press when I was 11, learned to balance the till at the farm stand by 12, learned to read a ledger before most kids my age could read a chapter book, because my grandfather sat me on an overturned crate beside him every Sunday afternoon and made me check his math. Not because he needed the help. Because he wanted someone in the family who understood what the numbers were actually saying. My father, Walter, worked the orchard too, but numbers made Walter's eyes glaze over the way they never did mine. And my uncle Harold, Walter's younger brother, didn't work the orchard at all if he could help it. Harold wanted the orchard's money, not its dirt under his fingernails. I need to tell you about Harold, because none of what happened to me makes sense without him, and because his son Derek is the cousin my parents decided should have my inheritance. Harold Whitfield was charming in the specific way that costs other people money. He borrowed against the orchard twice in the 1970s without telling Silas, once to buy into a failed ski resort development outside Altoona, once to cover gambling debts he never fully explained. Both times, Silas bailed him out, and both times, Silas told my father the same thing at the kitchen table: Harold has a hole in him that money falls straight through. I love him. I don't trust him. By 1988, Silas was 71 years old, his heart was failing, and he had exactly one decision left to make that mattered: what happened to the orchard when he was gone. He was not a sentimental man about business, whatever he was about family. He kept a ledger book, not a diary, and the only place he ever wrote down anything resembling feelings was in the margins of that ledger, in small, cramped pencil notes beside the columns of figures, notes like good crop, hard winter, glad of it, or, beside an entry recording another loan to Harold, simply again. I inherited that ledger book eventually, long after the trust itself, and I have read those margins more times than I can count, Because they told me more about how my grandfather actually thought than any conversation I remember having with him while he was alive. He didn't leave it to Walter outright, and he didn't leave it to Harold at all. He set up an irrevocable trust, the Silas Whitfield Family Trust, drafted by an estate attorney in Altoona named Foster Reyes, executed and recorded in the fall of 1988. I know the document by heart because I have read it more times than I've read my own marriage certificate. The trust gave Walter and his wife Joan, my mother, a life estate in the orchard. They could live on it, run it, draw income from it for as long as they were living and mentally competent to do so. But they never owned it outright, not for one single day of their lives. Ownership, full, unencumbered title, was set to vest in one person and one person only upon the earlier of two events, Walter's death, or a certified finding of Walter's permanent incapacity by two licensed physicians. That person was me. Not because I was the oldest grandchild. Not because I carried the name longest. Because I was the one Silas had trained, tested, and trusted with a ledger since I was 8 years old, and because he wrote, in his own handwriting, in a letter Foster Reyes kept with the trust file, Wren understands that an orchard is a debt you owe the next 50 years, not a windfall you spend in one. Harold was furious when the trust was read after Silas's death in 1994. He contested it, lost, and spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that his brother had stolen what should have been split evenly. Harold died in 2015, broke, having burned through 3 business ventures and 2 marriages. His son Derek inherited nothing but his father's resentment and, I would later learn, his father's talent for believing he deserved things he hadn't earned. I left Bellwood for college, came back with a degree in finance, and instead of running the orchard day to day, I went into trust administration, first as a junior analyst, then as an officer, then as vice president of trust administration at Bellwood Trust and Savings, the same small regional bank where half the county kept their savings and their secrets. My husband Douglas taught shop class at Bellwood High for 31 years. We raised 2 kids, Nathan and Paige, in a house 4 miles from the orchard, close enough that I drove past the front gate most mornings on my way to work. I married and took Douglas's name, which meant my children were Callaways, not Whitfields. I want you to remember that detail. It matters more than it should have. At the bank, my specialty became exactly the kind of document my grandfather had drafted without ever knowing the formal term for it: dynasty trusts, contingent remainder interests, life estates carved out for aging parents who wanted to protect a farm, a business, a piece of land from being sold out from under a family the moment sentiment overruled paperwork. I handled trusts for dairy operations in 3 counties, for a hardware store passed down through 4 generations in Hollidaysburg, for a family construction company whose founder didn't trust either of his 2 sons and split control between them and a niece nobody expected. I learned, case after case, that the families who fought hardest over inheritance were almost never fighting over money. They were fighting over who had been trusted, and who hadn't, and money simply happened to be the only language available to argue it in. I reviewed 19 contested trust administrations over the course of my career. I was never once overturned on appeal, not because I was clever, but because I read every document as though someone's whole life depended on my getting it exactly right, which, in every single case, it did. For 28 years, my parents ran the orchard the way Silas taught them, and I helped from a professional distance, reviewing tax filings, co-signing insurance renewals, sitting in on the rare meeting with Foster Reyes' successor firm when something needed a trust officer's signature. I never once thought about the day the trust would vest in me, because thinking about that day meant thinking about my father's death, and I wasn't in a hurry to do either. Then, 3 years ago, my father started forgetting things. It began small. He'd repeat a story twice in one conversation. He'd forget where he'd parked the truck in his own driveway. My mother covered for him the way spouses do, calling it tiredness, calling it stress, calling it anything but what it eventually became, which was a diagnosis. 2 years ago, Dr. Amos Fielding, who had treated my father for a decade, ordered a full cognitive workup after Walter got lost driving home from the pharmacy, a route he had driven for 40 years. The diagnosis was mild vascular dementia, early stage, progressive. Dr. Fielding was careful with his language. Walter still had good days. He could still hold a conversation, still recognize everyone, still make simple decisions with support. But his judgment on complex matters, financial matters, legal matters, was, in Dr. Fielding's clinical words, increasingly unreliable and expected to decline. I filed that diagnosis away the way I filed everything, in the part of my mind reserved for facts that would matter later, even if I didn't yet know how. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't learn for another 18 months, was that someone else in my family had filed that same diagnosis away too, and was already building a plan around it. Derek Whitfield, my cousin, is 41. He works, when he works, in equipment sales, and has moved through 4 jobs in the years I've watched him. His wife, Vanessa, is 37, a real estate agent with a talent for staging houses and an even sharper talent for reading people. I want to be fair to Vanessa the way I try to be fair to everyone in this story, because understanding a person's motives isn't the same as excusing what they did with them. Vanessa grew up the daughter of a man who lost the family hardware store to bankruptcy when she was 14, and she has told more than one person, including my mother, that she swore she'd never again watch a family let something valuable slip through their fingers out of sentimentality. I think Vanessa genuinely believed that taking the orchard from me and giving it to Derek was a kind of rescue. I think she also believed, correctly, that Derek would never get there on his own, and that she would have to build the case for him, brick by brick, in front of 2 aging in-laws whose grip on complicated decisions was already loosening. It started, as far as I can reconstruct it, about 2 years ago, not long after my father's diagnosis. Vanessa began driving my parents to their medical appointments, a genuinely kind gesture, one I was grateful for, since Douglas and I both still worked and Bellwood's specialists are 40 minutes away in Altoona. She started staying for dinner afterward. She started commenting, gently at first, on how tired my mother looked managing the orchard's books, how nice it would be if someone younger could take some of that weight. She brought up Derek's name often, always in the same soft, helpful tone. Derek's between jobs right now, Joan, he'd have so much time to learn the orchard. Derek's been asking about Grandpa Silas's old equipment, Walter, he really does love this place. None of it sounded like a campaign. It sounded like a young wife being thoughtful about her husband's future. That was the whole design of it. My mother told me, much later, that the phrase "keep it in the family" came from Vanessa first, months before my parents ever said it to me. Vanessa's argument, repeated at enough Sunday dinners to become furniture in the room, was this: Wren has her own name now. Her kids are Callaways. If the orchard goes to Wren, the Whitfield name eventually comes off the barn. But Derek is a Whitfield by blood and by name, and so is his son, little Silas. Derek and Vanessa had named their boy after my grandfather 3 years earlier, a detail I had thought was sweet at the time and would later understand as a down payment on exactly this moment. If the orchard goes to Derek, Vanessa said, the name goes on forever. It is a seductive argument if you don't look at it too closely. It appeals to something real, the fear that 100 years of a family's work might simply dissolve into someone else's last name. It also happens to be legally meaningless, sentimentally manipulative, and completely blind to the one document that actually controlled who owned that orchard. But my parents, in their 80s, tired, a little frightened by what was happening to my father's mind, heard "keep it in the family" and heard love. They didn't hear a woman quietly building a case. 14 months ago, Vanessa introduced my parents to an attorney named Gordon Aldrich. Gordon had been a general practice lawyer in Bellwood for nearly 50 years, the kind of small-town attorney who drafted wills for half the county and did closings for the other half, semi-retired now, working out of a converted garage behind his house with a part-time secretary 2 days a week. He was not an estate specialist. He was not, by that point, particularly sharp. I would later learn from his own former secretary that his malpractice carrier had quietly stopped renewing his policy the year before, and that most of his remaining clients were longtime friends who trusted the name on the door more than the man behind it. Vanessa knew Gordon socially through her real estate work. He had handled dozens of closings for her over the years. She recommended him to my parents as someone who already knows the family and won't charge an arm and a leg. What she actually got was a lawyer unlikely to ask hard questions. I want to slow down here, because this is the part of the story where I was still living my ordinary life, still going to my part-time consulting work, still having Sunday dinners with my parents, completely unaware that a deed was being drafted with my name written out of it. Looking back now, with the whole timeline laid out in front of me the way I eventually laid it out for a room full of my own family, I can see how deliberately staged those 2 years actually were. It wasn't one campaign. It was 4, each one built on the success of the last, each one small enough on its own to never raise an alarm. In the first stage, roughly 18 months before the deed was signed, Vanessa made herself useful. The driving to appointments, the grocery runs, the afternoon phone calls to my mother that always started with just checking on you too and always ended, eventually, somewhere near the subject of the orchard's future. In the second stage, about a year out, she began seeding the language, the phrase "keep it in the family," repeated at just enough Sunday dinners that by the time my parents said it to me themselves, they believed, sincerely, that it had been their own idea all along. In the third stage, roughly 8 months before the deed, she introduced Gordon Aldrich, framed as a favor, a kindness, a way to save the family money on legal fees for what she called just some simple paperwork. And in the fourth stage, the one I only fully understood after reading her own words on that shared drive, she watched my father's diagnosis the way a buyer watches a closing date, and she moved the moment she believed the window was open and closing. 10 months ago, my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that Walter had signed some papers with Gordon about the orchard, just to simplify things for the future. I asked what papers. She said she wasn't sure, something about naming Derek as a co-owner, so he could start learning the business properly. I felt the first cold drop of unease, the kind I used to feel at the bank when a client's signature card didn't quite match the one on file. But I told myself it was nothing more than a power of attorney, or maybe an employment arrangement. I asked to see the paperwork. My mother said Gordon had the originals and she'd get me a copy. She never did. 3 weeks later, when I asked again, she changed the subject to Paige's upcoming wedding shower. I let it go, because that's what you do with your mother when she's 85 and tired and doesn't want to talk about something. I let it go, and I have thought about that decision every day since, because it cost me 5 more months of not knowing what had already been done. 7 months ago, the dinner happened. The one I opened this story with. It was a Sunday in early spring, my mother's pot roast on the table, Douglas beside me, my father at the head of the table looking, that particular evening, both perfectly lucid and entirely resolved, the way people sometimes look right before they deliver news they've rehearsed. My mother set down the serving dish, sat, folded her hands, and said, "Wren, your father and I have been talking, and we've made a decision about the orchard. We want to keep it in the family. Derek's agreed to take it on." My father nodded along. Derek and Vanessa weren't even at the table that night, they'd arranged it that way, I would later understand, so that the announcement would come from my parents, softened by love, rather than from Derek, who might have had to answer harder questions. I sat very still. Douglas's hand found mine under the table. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, what exactly take it on meant. My mother said Derek would be taking over management, and eventually ownership, of the orchard, that they'd already had some paperwork drawn up with Gordon Aldrich to set the transition in motion, and that they hoped I would understand, because family was family, and the Whitfield name mattered, and Derek needed this in a way that I, with my career and my house and my kids all grown, simply didn't. My father added, gently, that he knew it might sting, but that I would always be welcome at the orchard, that nothing between us had to change. I want you to understand what it feels like to sit at your parents' table and watch them describe, in the softest possible language, giving away the one piece of your grandfather's legacy that he had specifically, deliberately, legally set aside for you and only you, 40 years before either of them had the courage to say it out loud. It feels like being told you were never really trusted, dressed up as a story about family. I didn't argue that night. I didn't raise my voice. I said, all right, the way I used to say it to a client whose numbers didn't add up but who wasn't ready to hear that yet. I folded my napkin. I thanked my mother for dinner. And I drove home in silence, Douglas beside me, both of us quiet until we reached our driveway, when he finally asked, Ren, are you going to fight this? And I told him the truth. I don't know yet what there is to fight. But I know something they don't. Here's what I knew, sitting in my kitchen that night with a cup of tea going cold in front of me. I knew that Walter Whitfield had never, not for one single day of his life, owned Whitfield Orchards outright. I knew that whatever paper Gordon Aldrich had drawn up, whatever deed or transfer or co-ownership arrangement my father believed he had the authority to sign, it could not lawfully move an inch of that land, because the land wasn't his to move. It belonged to a trust. And under the terms of that trust, on the day my father's competence to manage his own affairs became medically compromised, which, according to Dr. Fielding's own diagnosis, had arguably already happened, the orchard would vest entirely, automatically, and irrevocably in me. Not eventually. Not someday. The moment the second physician's certification was on file, if it ever needed to be, ownership was mine by operation of law, and no signature my father put on any document after that point would carry any legal weight at all. I didn't know, that first night, whether Derek and Vanessa had any idea the trust existed. I suspected they didn't, because if they had, none of this would have made sense. You don't spend a year building a campaign to convince two elderly people to sign away property they don't actually own. I suspected, correctly, that somewhere in a filing cabinet in my parents' house, or lost entirely, was a 40-year-old trust document that everyone in my family except me had simply forgotten was still in force. I had not forgotten. I had a certified copy in my own safety deposit box at Bellwood Trust and Savings, because 20 years earlier, as a young trust officer, I had specifically requested one, understanding even then that a family this size, with this much sentiment and this little organization, was exactly the kind of family that misplaced the documents that mattered most. At the IRS they'd call what I did next building a file. At the bank, we called it a title review. Whatever you call it, I spent the next 4 months doing it methodically, quietly, and without telling anyone in my family what I already suspected, because I had learned in 28 years of trust work that you never confront a beneficiary dispute with a theory. You confront it with a chain of title so clean nobody in the room can argue with it. The first thing I did was retrieve my certified copy of the 1988 trust from the bank. I read it start to finish, 4 times, the way I used to read every document before it crossed my desk for a signature. The language was exactly as I remembered it, exactly as clean as Foster Reyes had drafted it 36 years earlier, a life estate to Walter and Joan Whitfield jointly, remainder in fee simple to their daughter Renata Whitfield Calloway, vesting upon the death of the last surviving life tenant or upon a certified finding of permanent incapacity of Walter Whitfield, whichever occurred first, with incapacity to be established by written findings of 2 licensed physicians. I photographed every page. I made 3 copies. I put the original back in the box. The second thing I did was call my father's physician's office, using a healthcare proxy my parents had signed years earlier naming me as their secondary agent, a document that had never been revoked because, as far as I could tell, nobody had ever thought to revoke it. Dr. Fielding's office confirmed what I already knew from my mother's offhand comments. Walter's most recent cognitive evaluation, performed 11 months earlier, documented moderate impairment in executive function and complex decision-making, with a specific clinical note that he should not be relied upon to manage financial or legal matters without support. 1 physician's finding. Not 2. The trust required 2. That single missing signature was, I would come to realize, both the reason the scheme might have worked and the reason it eventually couldn't. The third thing I did was drive to the Blair County Recorder of Deeds in Altoona on a Tuesday, using my lunch hour the way I used to when I still worked full-time, and asked to search the record for any instrument affecting the Whitfield Orchards parcel. It took the clerk 9 minutes to pull it. A quitclaim deed, executed 5 months earlier, recorded 4 months earlier, purporting to convey an undivided 1/2 interest in the orchard property from Walter Whitfield to Derek Whitfield, in consideration of love and affection and future services rendered. Notarized by a Kathy Munn, commissioned in Blair County. Witnessed by Vanessa Whitfield and a name I didn't recognize. I photographed every page of that deed too, and I drove back to the office feeling exactly the way I used to feel when a fraud case finally had a physical document attached to it. Not triumphant. Just very, very steady. The fourth thing I did took the longest, and it's the part of this story I'm least comfortable telling, because it meant looking closely at people I love. I called Kathy Munn's employer, a title company in Altoona where she worked as a closing coordinator. Using a pretext I'm not proud of, I told her supervisor I was doing a routine chain of title verification for an unrelated refinance, which was true in spirit if not in fact, since I genuinely was a licensed notary myself and understood the questions to ask. Kathy's notary log, which by Pennsylvania law she was required to maintain and which her employer kept on file, showed an entry for the date the deed was executed. It did not show Walter Whitfield's name in the log at all. It showed only Vanessa Whitfield, notarized for an unrelated document that same afternoon. My father's acknowledgement on the deed, the sworn statement that he had personally appeared before the notary and signed the document in her presence, had no matching entry anywhere in her records. Either Kathy Munn had failed to log the notarization she actually performed, which is itself a violation of her commission, or she had notarized a signature without my father ever appearing before her at all. I didn't know which, not yet. I would find out. I called an old friend and former colleague, Carol Jennings, who had worked beside me at Bellwood Trust and Savings for 19 years before retiring to a small consulting practice specializing in elder financial abuse cases for the county's area agency on aging. Carol had seen more of this than I had. She'd spent her retirement doing what I had only encountered in the abstract, sitting across tables from adult children and grandchildren who had emptied their parents' accounts one gift card and one loan at a time. I called her on a Thursday evening and told her everything. She listened without interrupting for almost 20 minutes, which for Carol is a personal record. When I finished, she said, "Ren, I want you to hear this from someone who does this professionally and not just as your friend. What you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's a textbook case of undue influence layered on top of a legally defective conveyance. You don't even need to argue the undue influence, though God knows you could. You've got a deed signed by a man who didn't own the property, notarized in a way that may not have happened at all, based on a diagnosis that should have triggered exactly the safeguard your grandfather built 40 years ago. Carol came over the following Saturday with a legal pad and a thermos of coffee, and we sat at my own kitchen table for the first of what became a dozen working sessions over the next 4 months. She asked me questions I hadn't thought to ask myself yet. Had Gordon Aldrich pulled a title search before drafting the deed, and if not, was that a departure from the standard of care a reasonable attorney owed his client? Was Kathy Munn's notary bond even current? Had my parents signed anything else in the last 2 years that I hadn't found yet? A beneficiary change on a life insurance policy, a new power of attorney, anything else quietly redirected while everyone's attention stayed fixed on the orchard? That last question kept me up 2 full nights before I confirmed, with real relief, that the answer was no, at least not yet. Carol had spent 11 years by then sitting across tables from families exactly like mine, and she told me something during that first session that I wrote down and kept taped inside my folder for the rest of the process. The families who catch it in time always think they were lucky, she said. They weren't lucky, Wren. They were paying attention while everyone around them assumed nobody was. I asked her if she'd help me build the file properly, the way I used to build files at the bank, tab by tab, source by source. She didn't hesitate. You know I will, she said, and that was Carol, no speeches, no dramatics, just the exact kind of steady person you want beside you when a room is about to get difficult. I need to tell you about the 5th thing, because it's the piece that turned this from a legal problem into a moral one. Nathan, my son, works in IT support and had, over a Thanksgiving visit 2 years earlier, helped Derek set up a shared family cloud drive so relatives could pool old photographs of the orchard for Silas's 100th birthday tribute. Derek had never removed Nathan's administrative access, because Derek, like his father before him, was not a man who thought carefully about small details. Nathan mentioned this to me almost as an aside one evening, and I asked him, carefully, whether the shared drive might still contain anything relevant to the orchard transfer. I want to be honest with you about the ethics of what I did next, because Carol raised the same question I was already asking myself. I did not access anything private. I did not open personal messages, banking information, or anything outside the shared folder Derek himself had granted access to years earlier and never revoked. Inside that shared folder, in a subfolder labeled Orchard Planning, Vanessa had saved a series of documents, draft talking points for conversations with my parents, a spreadsheet estimating the orchard's value at $600,000 and projecting what she called long-term equity growth for Silas's future, and a text message thread she had exported and saved, apparently by accident, that included the line, from Vanessa to Derek, 11 months earlier, Walter's not going to get sharper. This is the window. Once he can't sign anything at all, it's over. We need Gordon to move fast. I sat with that message for a long time before I added it to my file. I told Nathan and Paige what I'd found, over dinner at my own house a week later, because I have never believed in protecting grown children from the truth about their own family, only in choosing carefully when they hear it. Paige, who was 6 months from her wedding and had spent her whole life watching Derek get treated, gently and without anyone ever quite saying it aloud, as the son my parents never had, went very quiet and then very angry, in that order. They were going to just let it happen, she said. They were going to let Grandpa Silas's whole life get handed to Derek because his last name matched the barn. Nathan was quieter about it, in his own way angrier, mostly at himself, for having helped Derek set up a shared drive he never thought to lock down, as though a man who couldn't keep his own affairs organized should somehow have anticipated that carelessness. I told him what I'll tell you now. Vanessa didn't get access to that folder because Nathan made a mistake. She got access to an entire family because 2 exhausted people in their 80s wanted, more than anything, to believe that keeping something in the family and giving it to the right person were the same decision. Nathan asked if there was anything he could do. I told him there was. He could help me organize the file the way I used to organize case files at the bank, and he did, spending 3 evenings building me a clean digital archive of every document, cross-referenced and dated, so that nothing I brought to that table would ever be questioned on the basis of disorganization. My children carried this with me quietly for 4 months, and neither of them ever once suggested I should let it go for the sake of peace. I have thought, more than once, about how different that dinner might have looked if I'd raised children who believed peace was worth more than the truth. I didn't. I'm grateful for that every day. I called Carol back and told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment and then she said something I've thought about many times since. Ren, some people steal because they're desperate. What your cousin's wife did is different. She read a diagnosis the way you'd read a closing bell on a stock, and she treated your father's mind slipping away as a market opportunity. I've seen greed and I've seen fear. This is closer to greed wearing fear's clothing. I didn't disagree with her. I spent the next month having Carol connect me with an elder law attorney she trusted completely, a woman named Priscilla Nolan who had built her entire 30-year practice around exactly this kind of case: capacity, undue influence, defective conveyances involving trusts. Priscilla reviewed everything I had assembled: the certified 1988 trust, the recorded quitclaim deed, Dr. Fielding's capacity documentation, Kathy Munn's incomplete notary log, and the shared drive materials, which Priscilla confirmed, after careful review, had been obtained through access Derek himself had granted and never revoked, making them legitimate to include. She read for the better part of 2 hours in her office on 2nd Street, and when she finally looked up, she said, "Renata, I want to be direct with you. This deed is void. Not voidable, void. Your father conveyed an interest he never held, because the trust already stripped him of unencumbered ownership the day it was executed in 1988. Even if he'd owned the land outright, I'd still be recommending we challenge this deed on capacity and undue influence grounds, because frankly, either one on its own would likely succeed. But you don't even need to get there. Walter Whitfield could not give away what he never owned, full stop." She paused, the way I imagine I used to pause before delivering the worst part of a finding to a client. There's also the matter of the notary. If Kathy Munn notarized a signature without your father present, that's not just a defect in this deed. That's notary fraud, and it exposes her to loss of her commission and potential criminal liability, and it exposes Gordon Aldrich to a malpractice claim so straightforward I'd be surprised if his insurer, assuming he still has one, doesn't settle it before it ever sees a courtroom. I asked her what she'd do, in my position. She said, "I'd get everyone in a room, present the facts once, cleanly, and give them the chance to undo this themselves before you ever have to file anything." That was exactly what I intended to do. I just needed one more piece first, and it took me another 6 weeks to get it. I asked Dr. Fielding's office, again through the healthcare proxy that had quietly outlived everyone's memory of it, whether Walter would consent to a second, formal capacity evaluation, the kind that could produce a written finding meeting the trust's specific two-physician requirement, not because I wanted to strip my father of anything, but because I needed the record to be unimpeachable, and because, honestly, I needed to know for my own peace of mind exactly where my father stood. My mother agreed, reluctantly, once I explained it was for insurance purposes, which was true, if incomplete. The evaluation, performed by a geriatric neurologist in Altoona named Dr. Priya Chandrasekaran, confirmed and slightly expanded on Dr. Fielding's earlier findings: moderate cognitive impairment consistent with early vascular dementia, significant difficulty with complex financial reasoning, and a specific note that Walter had, during the evaluation, been unable to correctly explain the difference between a life estate and outright ownership when asked, despite having lived the distinction for 36 years without ever fully understanding it. 2 physicians. 2 written findings. The trust's condition was now, formally and unambiguously, satisfied. Whatever ambiguity might have existed about whether the orchard had already vested in me before Derek's deed was even signed, there was none left now. I built the file the way I built every file that mattered in 28 years at the bank. Left section, the 1988 Silas Whitfield Family Trust, certified copy, every relevant clause highlighted, the vesting language underlined twice. Center section, the recorded quitclaim deed, Kathy Munn's incomplete notary log obtained through her employer's own records, a formal letter from Priscilla Nolan's office outlining the deed's legal defects. Right section, Dr. Fielding's original findings, Dr. Chandrasekharan's confirming evaluation, both physicians' written conclusions satisfying the trust's incapacity provision. Behind all of it, in a sealed folder I hoped I would never need to open in front of anyone but Priscilla, the shared drive materials, including Vanessa's message about the window before Walter can't sign anything at all. I labeled the whole thing, out of old habit, the way I labeled every case file at the bank for nearly 3 decades, Whitfield, Orchard Parcel, Title Review. 3 weeks before I called the family meeting, my mother mentioned that Derek and Vanessa had started talking about renovating the old farm stand, adding a tasting room, rebranding the cider under a new label with Derek's name attached as owner-operator. She showed me a mock-up Vanessa had made on her phone, genuinely excited, the way a mother gets excited watching what she believes is her family's legacy taking a hopeful new shape. I looked at that mock-up for a long moment, at Whitfield Family Cider, EST 1957, EST. Again by Derek Whitfield printed across the top in a friendly serif font, and I felt something in me go very quiet and very still, the way it used to when a fraud case finally had a name and a face and a plan behind it instead of just numbers. I didn't say anything to my mother that night beyond, "That's a nice design." I had already scheduled the meeting. I called it for a Sunday, my parents' house, the same table where the original announcement had been made 7 months earlier. I asked Priscilla Nolan to attend as counsel and witness. I asked Carol Jennings to come as well, not as a lawyer, but as someone with no blood stake in the outcome who could later confirm exactly what was said and how it was received, the way Dorothy sat beside Wanda, the way every family like ours seems to need one steady, unrelated person in the room. I told my parents only that I wanted to discuss the orchard transition with everyone present, including Derek and Vanessa, and that I'd be bringing some paperwork to go over. My mother, I think, believed I was finally coming around to the idea. I let her believe that, because I had learned, over 4 months of quiet documentation, that the truth lands better when nobody in the room has had time to prepare a defense against it. The Sunday arrived cold and clear, early autumn, the orchard visible from my parents' kitchen window with the trees just beginning to turn. My mother had made a roast, the same as always, and set the table for 7, Walter and Joan, Douglas and me, Derek and Vanessa, and an extra place for Priscilla, whom my mother had assumed, kindly, must be joining us as a friend of mine. Carol arrived separately and sat quietly near the window with a legal pad she never opened, exactly as we'd planned. Derek shook my hand when he came in, easy and warm, no idea what was coming. Vanessa hugged me, said she loved my sweater, asked how Paige's wedding planning was going. I answered her questions the way you answer a stranger's questions at a funeral, politely, from somewhere slightly outside your own body. We ate first. I insisted on it, the same way I'd have insisted on it at the bank before delivering bad news to a client. Nobody negotiates while hungry, and nobody should be able to say afterward that they were ambushed before they'd even had a chance to sit down. Derek talked about a new equipment sales route he was starting. Vanessa talked about a listing she'd just closed. My father, on one of his better days, told the story about the squeezer press breaking down during a church picnic in 1979, a story I'd heard 40 times and was, that particular evening, grateful to hear again, because it was the last easy thing that happened at that table. When the plates were cleared, I placed the file on the table between the serving dish and the bread basket, the way I used to lay a client's account history in front of them before I explained, gently and completely, exactly where their money had gone. I put on my reading glasses, the same tortoiseshell pair I'd worn at the bank for 2 decades, and I said, I want to talk about the orchard, and I want to do it once, completely, and I'd ask that nobody interrupt until I'm finished. My father nodded, still relaxed, still no idea. Derek leaned back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who believed this conversation had already gone his way months ago. Vanessa's eyes went straight to the folder, and something in her face changed by a degree so small I doubt anyone else at the table caught it. I caught it. 28 years of reading people across a desk teaches you to catch it. I opened to the first tab. This is my grandfather's trust, I said, the Silas Whitfield Family Trust, executed in 1988, 6 years before he died. I have a certified copy. I imagine most of you have never seen it, because I suspect most of you didn't know it still existed. I read the vesting language aloud, slowly, the way Silas himself might have read a ledger entry he wanted understood completely. Walter and Joan hold a life estate, the right to live on this land and draw its income for as long as they live and remain competent to manage it. They have never, for one day, held title to it outright. Full ownership vests in me, automatically, by the terms of this document, upon the death of the last surviving life tenant, or upon a certified medical finding of permanent incapacity affecting Walter's ability to manage his own affairs. Whichever happens first. My mother's face had gone pale. My father was staring at the page, his mouth slightly open, the particular expression I had learned, over the last 2 years, to recognize as him trying to hold on to a thread of a conversation that was moving faster than he could follow. Derek's easy posture had disappeared entirely. Dad, I said, as gently as I could manage, about a year ago you signed a deed with Gordon Aldrich giving Derek a half-interest in the orchard. I know you believed you had the right to do that. I need you to understand that you didn't, because this land was never yours to give away. It belonged to a trust that's been sitting in a filing cabinet, forgotten, for 36 years. Nobody moved for what felt like a full minute. My mother's hand had gone to her mouth. My father was still staring at the certified copy of the trust as though he could will the words on the page to rearrange themselves into something less final. Douglas sat beside me, silent, the way he'd been silent through every rehearsal of this moment I'd put him through in our own kitchen over the previous month, there simply to be a steady presence, the way a spouse is supposed to be. Carol, by the window, had still not opened her legal pad. She didn't need to. She only needed to remember. Vanessa found her voice first, the way she always did. That's, Walter's owned that orchard his whole life, Wren, everybody knows that. You're talking about some old paper from before I even knew this family. I'm talking, I said, about the only document that has ever legally controlled who owns this land. And I'd like to move to the second section, because it matters just as much. I turned the page. This is the deed Gordon Aldrich drafted, recorded 4 months after it was signed. It's notarized by a woman named Kathy Munn. I placed the notary log beside it, the pages I'd obtained from her employer. This is Kathy Munn's own notary log for that date. My father's name does not appear in it. Under Pennsylvania law, a notary is required to log every acknowledgement she performs. If my father never appeared before her, and this log suggests he didn't, then this deed wasn't just built on land nobody had the authority to give away. It was also notarized fraudulently. The table had gone completely silent except for the tick of the clock over the stove, the one that had hung there since I was a child. "Ren," Derek said, and his voice had lost most of its ease, "I don't know anything about a notary log." My dad signed the papers Gordon put in front of him. "That's between Gordon and whoever." "I understand," I said. "I'm not finished." I turned to the third section. "This is a capacity evaluation my father's physician completed almost a year ago, and a second evaluation completed 6 weeks ago, at my request, by a specialist in Altoona. Both physicians found that Dad's ability to manage complex financial and legal decisions is significantly impaired." 2 physicians' findings. That's exactly what the trust requires to certify incapacity, which means that even if I'm wrong about everything else, even if this land had somehow, impossibly, belonged to my father outright, his ability to lawfully sign that deed at all is itself in serious question. I looked at my father, and I made my voice as soft as I could while still being clear. "Dad, I'm not saying this to embarrass you. I'm saying it because you deserve to understand exactly what happened to you, and because I love you too much to let it stand." My father's eyes had filled. He didn't speak. My mother reached for his hand across the table. Vanessa tried again, sharper now. "This is insane, Ren. You're going to drag your own father's diagnosis into a legal fight over an orchard? That's cruel. That's using his illness against him." "No," I said, and for the first time that evening my voice was not gentle. "You used his illness against him. I have a message, Vanessa, that I'd rather not have to read at this table, but I will if I need to. It's a text you sent Derek 11 months ago, saved in a folder you never realized my son still had access to. You wrote that Walter wasn't going to get sharper, that this was the window, and that once he couldn't sign anything at all, it would be over. You watched my father's mind slip, and instead of grieving it with the rest of this family, you built a timeline around it. I have never, in my life, watched color leave a face as fast as it left Vanessa's in that moment." Derek turned to look at her, and something in his expression cracked open, not disbelief, I don't think, but the particular pain of a man realizing his wife had been managing him as carefully as she'd been managing my parents. That message isn't what it sounds like," Vanessa said, and her voice had climbed half an octave. "I was talking about, Derek needed to make a decision before my father lost the ability to make one for himself," I finished for her. "I know exactly what you meant, Vanessa. I've spent 28 years reading documents written by people who hoped nobody would ever read them this carefully." My father spoke then, for the first time since I'd opened the folder, and his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Ren." He caught his own slip, the way he sometimes did now, reaching for a name that wasn't quite the right one and correcting himself half a second too late. "I signed that because Gordon said it was simple. He said it would just make things easier. I didn't understand it was, I didn't know it wasn't mine to give." "I know, Dad," I said, and I meant it completely. "I'm not angry at you. I need you to hear that clearly, because everything I'm about to say next is not a punishment aimed at you. It's a correction aimed at what was done to you." Priscilla spoke for the first time, her voice calm and procedural, exactly the register I'd asked her to hold. "I want to be clear about the legal posture here, for everyone's benefit. Renata has grounds to seek a declaration that this deed is void ab initio, both because Mr. Whitfield lacked authority to convey an interest the trust never gave him, and independently, on the basis of the capacity findings you've all just heard. She also has grounds to report the notarization irregularities to the Pennsylvania Department of State, which could result in the revocation of Ms. Munn's commission, and potentially a referral for criminal investigation depending on what Ms. Munn says when asked directly whether Mr. Whitfield was present. And she has a strong basis for a claim against Mr. Aldrich for legal malpractice, given that a competent estate attorney would have located and reviewed the 1988 trust before drafting any conveyance of this property at all. None of that requires proving Vanessa's intent. The document evidence on its own is more than sufficient. The kitchen was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator hum. But, I said, I didn't ask you all here tonight to file anything. I asked you here because I wanted this correction to happen at this table, among family, before it ever has to happen in a courtroom in Altoona with strangers watching. I closed the folder, the way I used to close a file once every page had been laid out and understood. Here's what happens now. Derek, I need you to sign a document Priscilla has prepared, quit claiming back whatever purported interest was conveyed to you, formally and on the record. It costs you nothing, because you were never given anything the law recognizes as yours to begin with. I'm not asking you to give anything up. I'm asking you to stop holding on to something you never actually had. Derek looked at Vanessa once, a long look I couldn't fully read, and then he looked back at me and nodded, slowly. Yeah, he said. Yeah, okay. Mom, Dad, I continued, the orchard stays exactly where Grandpa Silas put it, in your life estate, for as long as you both are able to enjoy it. Nothing changes for either of you tomorrow morning. You still live there. You still draw the income. I am not taking this from you, I am simply confirming what was always true, that neither of you ever had the authority to give it away, and neither did I ever expect you to have to. My mother was crying quietly now, not the performed kind of crying I'd read about in other family stories, but the exhausted kind, the kind that comes from finally setting down a weight you'd been carrying without fully understanding how heavy it was. Ren, I am so sorry, she said. We should have shown you the paperwork the first time you asked. I told myself it was simple. I didn't want it to be complicated. I know, I said. I forgive you both. I need you to know that, clearly, tonight, because I don't want either of you carrying guilt over this for whatever time you have left. What happened here wasn't really about you two making a bad decision. It was about someone who saw your love for family and used it as a door. I turned, finally, to Vanessa, and I kept my voice level, because I had learned a long time ago that the calmest voice in the room is always the one people remember longest. I'm not going to report the notary log to the state tonight. I'm not going to file a malpractice claim against Gordon Aldrich tonight, though frankly, given what I now know about his practice, someone eventually should, and it may not be my hand that does it. I'm choosing not to do either of those things tonight because Derek is my cousin, because my father still loves his brother's memory even after everything Harold cost this family, and because I don't believe destroying every person at this table serves my grandfather's memory any better than losing the orchard would have. But I want to be very clear with you, Vanessa. If I ever hear of you contacting my parents about this property again, if I ever hear of another deed, another attorney, another simple paperwork conversation, I will file everything, all of it, the same day. This folder does not get smaller from here. It only gets thicker. Vanessa didn't answer. She sat very still, her hands folded on the table in front of her, and for the first time all evening she looked, to me, less like the woman who had orchestrated an 18-month campaign against two aging in-laws and more like exactly what Carol had described weeks earlier, someone who had mistaken cruelty for competence, and was only now beginning to understand the difference. Derek signed the quitclaim that evening, at that table, with Priscilla witnessing and Carol as the second witness. His hand was steadier than I expected. When he set the pen down, he said, quietly, to no one in particular, I think I knew, somewhere, that this was never really going to be mine. I just didn't want to say it out loud, because Vanessa made it sound so simple. I didn't say anything back. Some admissions don't need a response. they just need to be heard. The dinner ended the way those dinners always seem to end in every family that survives one, not with reconciliation, exactly, but with the beginning of it. Derek and Vanessa left first, in near silence. My mother walked me and Douglas to the car and held on to my arm a moment longer than usual before letting go. My father stood in the doorway, the porch light behind him, and said, "Ren, for what it's worth, your grandfather always said you were the one who understood what things were actually worth." I should have remembered that before I signed anything. I told him it was worth quite a lot, and that I loved him, and that neither of those things had ever been in question. In the months since that dinner, the record was formally corrected at the Blair County Recorder of Deeds, Priscilla's office filing the quitclaim alongside a memorandum confirming the trust's controlling terms, so that anyone who ever pulled the chain of title in the future would find the true history laid out clean and complete. Kathy Munn, when Priscilla's office contacted her directly, admitted, through her attorney, that she had notarized the acknowledgement based on Vanessa's assurance that Walter would sign later and it would all be fine, a shortcut that cost her notary commission by the end of the year. I never pursued the malpractice claim against Gordon Aldrich. His secretary told Carol, months later, that he had quietly stopped taking new estate clients altogether, which felt, to me, like consequence enough for a man who had simply grown too tired to do the careful work his profession required. Derek and Vanessa separated 4 months after that dinner. I don't know the whole story, and I've been careful not to ask for it, but Derek reached out to me privately last spring, sober and a little raw, and asked if he could come by the orchard sometime, not to talk about ownership, just to help with the fall harvest the way he used to as a boy before his father taught him to resent what he never earned. I said yes. He's worked 3 Saturdays a month since then, on the sorting line, learning the equipment properly this time, for no ownership stake at all, just the work itself. I think, in his own slow way, he's trying to become the kind of Whitfield my grandfather would have trusted, rather than the kind his father raised him to be. My parents are both still living, both still on the orchard, my mother sharper some days than others, my father gentler now than he's ever been, the two of them sitting most evenings on the same porch where Silas used to sit with his ledger. The trust remains exactly as Silas wrote it in 1988, waiting, patiently, the way trusts do, for the day it will finish what it was always designed to do. I am, on paper and in fact, the eventual outright owner of Whitfield Orchards and Cider Mill, 42 acres and 100 years of family history, worth by last appraisal a little over $600,000. I don't think of it as money I'm owed. I think of it as a debt my grandfather asked me, 8 years old on an overturned crate, to spend the rest of my life understanding how to carry. I renamed nothing. The barn still says Whitfield. The cider jugs still say Whitfield. My children are Callaways and always will be, and I have made my peace, finally, with the idea that a name on a label was never what my grandfather actually meant to protect. What he protected was judgment, the specific, patient, unglamorous kind of judgment that reads a document twice before it signs anything, that asks who actually owns a thing before it decides who deserves it, that understands the difference between love and inheritance and never, ever confuses the two. If someone in your family has ever told you they were giving away what's yours to keep it simple, or to keep it in the family, I want you to hear this clearly. Simple is usually the word people use right before they hope you won't ask questions. Family is usually the word people use right before they redraw its boundaries to leave you outside them. Ask for the paperwork. Read it twice. And if somewhere in a drawer or a safety deposit box or an old attorney's dusty file cabinet, there's a document written decades ago by someone who trusted you before anyone else remembered to, go find it. It might be the only thing standing between you and a room full of people who've already decided your inheritance belongs to someone else. Paige got married that spring, in the orchard itself, under the same row of Baldwin apple trees my great-grandfather planted with a mule team in 1931. My father walked her partway down the aisle, leaning on Douglas's arm more than his own, and made it the whole distance, which was more than any of us had quietly let ourselves hope for a year earlier. Derek came to the wedding alone. He brought little Silas, who is 7 now and has taken, this past summer, to following me around the sorting shed asking questions about the press the way I once followed my grandfather, and I will admit that watching him do it undid something in me I didn't expect. I've started teaching him the way Silas taught me, one Sunday afternoon at a time, not because the trust requires it, but because somebody in this family should grow up understanding what the orchard is actually worth, and it might as well be the one Whitfield boy who never asked to inherit his father's resentments. Carol still comes by most Thursdays, officially to check on my mother, unofficially to drink coffee at my kitchen table and remind me, whenever I start to feel guilty about how hard I was on Vanessa that night, that gentleness toward a wrongdoer is not the same thing as justice toward everyone else at the table. Priscilla Nolan sends me a card every year on the anniversary of that dinner, which feels strange until you. My name is Renata Calloway. I spent 28 years making sure people understood exactly what they owned and exactly what they didn't. My grandfather spent one afternoon in 1988 making sure of the same thing about me, 40 years before I'd ever need it. That's not luck. That's what it looks like when someone plans further ahead than the people around them are willing to imagine. If this story reminded you to go find your own family's paperwork, do it this week, not someday. Drop a comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to check the fine print. Subscribe to Gia Mom Stories for more, and remember, the trust always outlasts the argument.